and we'll proceed from there. Let me start by just making sure many of you have done this before. You know the housekeeping items. For the purposes of the first half an hour to 45 minutes or so, I prefer not to have a lot of interruptions for questions, but if you got a burning issue that you want to talk about with a comment that I've made, feel free to throw it in the chat box or raise your hand or whatever you want to do there. We'll try to get this moving and give it 45 minutes. It's not a long session today, and you give the extra time for questions. Want to mention just at the outset, this is sponsored by or supported by this group called Organizational Excellence Specialist that I've been a part of for the better part of a year and a half. Their real focus, it was formed by a woman by the name of Dawn Ringrose, who's in Canada and British Columbia, with a focus on, for 10 years or more, really tracking where the world is going in terms of performance excellence. On the basis that there's a small percentage, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10% of organizations that have done something related or are doing something related to performance excellence using a framework, whether it be in the terms of Canada, the Canada Excellence Award, the Baldrige Award in the United States. There's several of those frameworks across the world, and Dawn put that together, sort of, I call it, sanitized it in a way and said, let's do an assessment of how the world is doing in terms of excellence. So this is part of that organizational excellence. I'm going to focus on the definitions of benchmarking and the title here, Transformational Leadership Opportunity. The reason I use those words is, as you'll see as I go forward with my remarks today, we need more organizations that are really focused on excellence, yes, but comparing and being willing to look at where they're going. If you take just what's happened just in the last day or so, I take the newspaper today and pick up the paper, and there's from yesterday another report from the United Nations on climate change. And so we've got some really severe existential threats, and it's my position, as referenced in this discussion today, that we've got to do more in terms of finding best practices, benchmarking, and so forth across the world. So consider this in the context of that. And then in terms of organizational excellence, what do? They do assessments, as I mentioned, on where organizations are across numerous sectors, whether it be public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, education, healthcare. Where is the world in terms of excellence? When you break it down to benchmarking, they've got data over the last several years that shows, sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, where is the world in terms of benchmarking, those that are doing something related to that. And it comes in 2 different iterations they've done. It's somewhere on a scale of 1 to 10. They're close to a 3, a 4, or 5. So maybe they're halfway into it, but it's one of the lowest assessments in terms of a tool available. So that's part of the reason we're involved with this. We're trying, as part of organizational excellence, 2 initiatives this year and last year, starting in the summer, both the public sector and the education sector, to get more organizations. If we're at 5 or 8 or 10%, can we get to 15 or 20% of organizations that are at least going down a path of excellence and potentially the use of benchmarking? So that's the rationale behind this. Take to the next slide. This is simply a look at, this is my material that I prepared based upon my business. So we're just asking everyone that eventually gets a copy of this to respect it, and any ideas you want to follow up, please contact me. And for those on the line that don't know me, several of you do. Dan knows me, Guy Gordon knows me, and so forth. But beyond that, some of you on the session today not much of an idea perhaps of where I am. I've had a history of sort of it's almost half and half, 50% private sector, 50% public sector. I started my career in the early 70s working for an organization that was known pretty well for excellence back then, Xerox, but they went through a transition and almost went to bankruptcy on a global basis. I worked for General Mills, a big food company here in Minneapolis, Control Data Corporation in the technology industry. And then in the public sector, I've worked in both the Minnesota Department of Revenue and the Florida Department of Revenue. My focus for the last 15, 20 years has been on benchmarking as it relates to business versus government. I focus in on business process management, just about all of the functions you could identify in most organizations. And the location, I've had the opportunity to work with people, some of those on the session today, United States. I linked in with some of my tax work with people in the tax agencies in Europe and Belgium, Japan, Canada. So I've had a ample amount. In all humility, yeah, there's a lot of growth areas across the world, but I've touched quite a few areas of the focus that really drives why I'm doing this benchmarking session today. And then this one quote here at the beginning, which is, some of you have probably seen this before if you've been around long enough. This is the quote from John Kennedy in the early 60s, that we want to go to the moon. Difficult thing to do. Benchmarking is not easy. Going out and comparing yourself to somebody else and being humble enough to learn from the rest of the world. So this is a quote from the early 60s. But as I mentioned earlier, when you look at where we are with in the pandemic for the last 2-3 years, you look at climate change, there's a lot of organizations that are not being managed very well. Where I sit here in Minneapolis, you've seen what's happened in the city of Minneapolis in the last 2 to 3 years with the George Floyd situation. Our city of Minneapolis used to be one of the best managed cities in the country, no longer considered in that area. So I'm looking at this from the standpoint of this kind of a perspective. The goal is we want to focus in on, yes, the difficult things to do, but where we are as a planet, do we have 5 or 10 years to continue to do incremental change? I think it's more in the sense of we need, as I call it, quantum leaps in change. So that's what's behind my thoughts today. We're going to spend time on 5 items. What is benchmarking? Why should I do it? A little more detail than what I just mentioned. Who's doing it now? If I mention 5-10%, or in the case of the OES assessments, that who is doing benchmarking now and who has sustained it? Part of this is, yes, go out and do comparisons, but how do you sustain it for a considerable period of time? Is my organization ready for benchmark? Can you do this off the cuff? Can you do this, from the bottom up? Perhaps. But how do I get ready for it? How do I begin it? What are some of the specific steps? And then what resources? So we'll go through this in the short time period of a little less than an hour. I've got another session we put out as part of the OES calendar events that will be held in May, where I will do a whole day's session on benchmarking. But this is just going to be a quick rundown on my assessment of where we are in terms of benchmarking. Learning process. What I like to say in the case of when you're going out and doing external benchmarking is think in terms of the boots of the customer, as they call it in the world of that, where Dan is and Guy Gordon has been, outside in mentality. When I was in the computer industry, we spent a lot of time internally defining something. Or if you're in a startup, you define it in your garage and then you go out and it's called product push or technology push. Push it from the inside to the outside and find somebody. If you're going to sustain something for a long time, I think that research, both in the public and the private sector, has said you got to think in terms of outside in the customer and think outside your comfort zone. Some of the things you learn in benchmarking. When I was at the Florida Department of Revenue, before I got there, they went out and compared tax processing of boxes of returns compared to FedEx. Somebody would say, what's FedEx compared to taxes? Well, you're processing a lot of boxes. So you got to be able to think outside your comfort zone with a commitment to this performance excellence. So that's the focus. If we had more time today, I'd spend time with each of you to define 3 organizations that exemplify excellence and explain why. In many cases, you could take private sector. If I take the healthcare sector, here in where I sit in the state of Minnesota, it's about 90 miles from where I sit. We have an organization called the Mayo Clinic. Well, the Mayo Clinic has done a lot from the healthcare side in terms of innovation, but it's also done a lot in many of its operations focused in on Baldrige in terms of how they manage an institution. And so if you were to go through, and we had the time today to say 3 organizations that exemplify excellence in terms of how you would know it as a performance excellent framework, not necessarily excellence in terms of are you making money. There's a lot of organizations. Now I just picked up the paper today that says Amazon is going to lay off 10,000 people again. Well, Amazon, many people would say, I use them. Well, they're an excellence, but do they exemplify excellence as we know it? So that's what I'm looking for in terms of examples if we had time to take input from everyone. So what is benchmarking in an informal and a structured sense? What I have here is start out seeking out and identifying world-class practices adopted and adapted to achieve. Now the words there are the 2 A's one. And it gets to this term that I've shared with some of you on the session today. It's called NIH, not invented here. I just had a session yesterday. I'm trying to pursue some benchmarking for startups in Minnesota. We've had an economic development agency here for 10 years. They're doing a lot with startups, as many other municipalities. But how do you get somebody to be at a point to look at how you do startups? It's called the ecosystem compared to not just Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana. How do you get them to compare to other countries of the world? Well, they're different. We're in Minnesota. So this whole sense of not invented here, or how can you learn from somebody outside? So here it's a methodology, a structured methodology. And I'll get into a little bit in a few more minutes about, informality. But benchmarking has become a discipline for those that practice it. So you're constantly looking outside for those world-class, and you have to adapt them. The premise here is that many of you can attest to this. To me, 70 to 80% of what you do in organizations is very similar. So if you're doing HR, if you're doing hiring, how you do it, a lot of similarity. Yes, there's uniqueness due to culture. Yes, there's uniqueness due to people. But to be able to learn 70, 80% and get over that, not invented here. And then on a broad basis, the reason I have a second definition here is because it's a relentless process. It's not a one-off kind of thing you do one year because one person wants to do it and you get it and maybe you get the results you intended and then you go on. It's a relentless discovery process, understanding best practice solutions. I was fortunate when I worked at the Minnesota Department of Revenue and when I worked eventually at the Florida Department of Revenue, I was the chief benchmarking officer. So we had multiple teams all over the agency that were going outside to look in other countries. That's how I got linked in eventually to Guy Gordon in Canada with the ICCS, other organizations that were involved with taxes. But a relentless process. So it's part and parcel, just like finance, just like marketing, just like sales. Benchmarking should be practiced in that sense to strategic discovery process to be able to, here I get back to the words I mentioned earlier, quantum leaps in superior exceptional performance. We can't wait 5 or 10 years. Incremental stuff that some of us may have learned back in the 80s and 90s with the Japanese of incremental change. We don't have 40 or 50 years like the Japanese had in the post-World War II period. So I'm saying we've got to focus in on how do we identify and accelerate to the point where we've got eventually quantum leaps. So we're not doing incremental change, we're doing accelerated change. So you got to look at benchmarking in both contexts, I would say. Okay, what is it? When you drill it down to start it, if you haven't had a focus on benchmarking or you're beginning to say working with other organizations, how do you get going? Well, you can start with informality. And there's some out there that would advise some of those involved with organizations I'm a part of, the Global Benchmarking Network, saying, well, let's practice informal benchmarking. Well, you share within your own office, or you pick up the paper, or you go to a networking session. I would focus more on it's a structured discipline and a process. When I get into my full day session, we walk through what this 8-step business process is. When you look at the founder of benchmarking, at least in the United States, a guy named Robert Camp, who worked at Xerox after I departed, but he was part of the Xerox sustainability effort. This is a very structured process. And he's now he's part of our global benchmarking network, but he's fostered that. And so we're trying as part of this effort with OES, with the Global Benchmarking Network, to sustain this focus on benchmark. He wrote, I think, 4 or 5 books on benchmark, but they don't get a lot of readability and application in business schools and elsewhere. So that's the beginning, to just get an idea of informal versus formal. Formal side, you can drill it down several ways. Performance metric. You have to start by saying, where am I today? If you use the example I've had before, which is, how long does it take us to hire here? Okay, when I was at the Florida Department of Revenue, we did an assessment, and it took us, in some cases, 90, 120, 180 days to hire people. And we would ask from the outside in, who's the customer? Ask the hiring manager, what should that be? What's the ideal? 30 days, 15 days. So if you've got a case where your current standard is 180 days and the customer is saying, gee, it ought to be 30 days or less, if you can't meet that standard and you're an outside business, you're not going to be around long. So that's performance metric. Or you can take process steps, actual steps. How long does it take to hire somebody? And what are the steps involved? You look at your organization and it says we have 42 steps. Somebody else has 25. We did that in the Florida Department of Revenue. And we found in our process analysis that the last 3 or 4 steps in our hiring was send it up the hierarchical chain to the point where the top, leaders in the divisions and so forth were signing off on every requisition for our hiring with no knowledge of what's going on. So we eliminated a lot. So it's business process, your steps versus that, or look at best practices. These are ways to break down your benchmarking approach. Why do it? What are the financial and other benefits of doing it? You can look at various studies that have done over several years. Our Global Benchmarking Network did one where we said if you can invest 10, 15, 20, 25,000 in a structured project, you can get an average return, if you do it properly, of 250,000. A huge return. But again, take that back. Many organizations are not doing it. Why do it? Because you can get that accelerated change, address external demands for change. People want that. It's being done by a lot of your competition, especially what I saw in the private sector. When I was there in the computer industry, we were a large 60,000 employees, a $4 billion company that eventually went out of business. Why? Because they said, here comes Apple Computer. Here comes Bill Gates and Microsoft, they're going to take over the industry. Nah, not going to happen. Never going to happen. It did. Think of a company by the name of Kodak. Here comes Fuji camera. Oh, nope. So it's sustainability is what that is for over time, and benchmarking can give you that. Because it all started, as many of you may know, with the Japanese in the post-World War II period. Who went to Japan? Dr. Deming, Dr. Duran, Phil Crosby, all of the gurus that were from the United States went to Japan to help them out. Now we're in a reverse situation. So that's the benefits financially. Why do we do it more from a holistic and human standpoint? Build an energizing, compelling vision for your organization's potential. I would expect some of you have seen over the last probably 10 years or more, organization called Gallup that used to do just political polling. But now they've done a Gallup assessment of engagement across the world. And for at least 10 years, 8 to 10 years or more, they come out with a results year in, year out saying only 20 to 30% of our people are totally engaged. 70% of people who come to work, and this is not just the United States, it's public sector, private sector, other countries, are not engaged in what they're doing. They're just there. They may be waiting for the next job. Now they've got, the great resignation and, post-COVID period. But the organization's performance potential, you can get that from finding out who some of the winning benchmarking organizations are, to lead to a stretch goal, 5 or 10%. But I looked at it when we were in the tax business, but that's what the customers and citizens expect. If you do, as Dan has done and others in ICCS, they've done the customer citizen expectations. What do citizens expect? That outside in. Many of us here in the U.S. and probably other places have said, well, you're in the tax business, death and taxes, there will always be a tax agency, so why do you have to step out and lead? When we were in the state of Florida, we had a governor who is now a senator from Florida, who I won't mention, but some of you may know. He came to us and told us, don't do any more benchmarking and getting better because you're upsetting the status quo of the other agencies that are there. So to deliver what the citizens expect, nah, we don't want to do. But for those that are out there leading, to be in the top 5 or 10% is part of it. Built to last. Some of you may go back 15, 20 years or more. There was a book written by called Built to Last. You take one of the companies in there was right here in Minnesota, 3M Corporation, still exists up in St. Paul. They've had their peaks and valleys, but they've existed for over 100 years. I was in the computer industry, as I mentioned. We existed for maybe 50 and it's gone. So you build a commitment to exceed your customers, your citizens' expectations. That's what benchmarking can give you a perspective on and find those that are going. Okay, let's just walk through a little bit. Let me walk through some of those that I've come across, just so you got some sense. And Dan knows and Guy knows I have some perspective here in Canada. But the one thing I really was enlightened by seeing many years ago, going back to 2012, if not before, the province of Ontario, and I went out and looked a few weeks ago, if it's still there, they had money back guarantees. So if you apply for a death certificate, if you apply for a birth certificate, whatever the service is, and they say it's going to be delivered in 2 weeks, and it's going to cost you, pick a number, $100. If they don't deliver it in 2 weeks, you get your money back guaranteed. Now, how many state tax agencies can sit there and say, you don't get your tax refund in 2 weeks, then we'll give you an extra bump for that, whatever that is. But that's, how did they do that? They did a process analysis. And I talked to them back then time when they would go through and say, just like FedEx, everything's going to arrive by 10:30 in the morning. Well, they would say, gee, if somebody, a citizen called and said, where is my application and my final birth certificate or whatever the case may be, they would say, gee, it's you'll get there in another hour because we can track right down to the point of the, just like Amazon supposedly does now today. So if that's still there, and then you've got Dan and Guy at the Institute for Citizen Centered Service, where they built a whole database of benchmarking. We've got our Baldrige Award recipients. Since 2006, I helped get Baldrige going, the Baldrige level here in Minnesota way back in 1985. But we got Baldrige Award recipients. They're doing benchmarking. But again, as you walk through these, this still boils down to maybe 8-10% of all organizations that, number one, know what benchmarking is. Number two, are actually practicing. Then we've got a municipal benchmarking initiative, used to be called AMBI, across Canada. That's got, I think, 15, 16, 17, something like that, municipalities coming together that are comparing. It's called a community of practice, coming together on a regular basis. Then you find the same thing. Singapore done something similar to the Institute for Citizen Service in Singapore. So you got these other countries. We used to have in the United States, a performance measurement center in ICMA, the International City County Managers Association. So there's been and remains a history here to do that. And then in terms of current time frame, my involvement of the Global Benchmarking Network for the last 7-8 years, even during COVID, we've had global competitions. Yes, it's an award, but it's an opportunity on a global basis to submit. If you've got a best practice, submit it and present a little bit. It's not a big Baldrige Award kind of thing, but it allows you to see what the rest of the world is doing. And some of this is very extraordinary. I've been fortunate to be a judge in some of these best practices for the last 2-3 years. I was in Abu Dhabi in 2018, where we went through that process. But the net is, you see some of the countries represented here: India, Iran, New Zealand, Philippines. But for the last 5 years, maybe we had 1 or 2 from the United States that were there. We had a city in Colorado that won the Baldrige Award. That was part of the presentation there and so forth. But very few American or North American countries are willing to at least submit 1 or 2. As Robin Mann, who's the chair of our GBN, puts out, everybody's got some kind of best practice that they feel good about, that they should be willing. So these are the organizations that are doing some semblance of benchmark. Here's a few more. Break it down into different healthcare sectors and the education sector. I talked about my involvement in global tax agencies. We at one point, and Quentin, who's on the session today, was in Missouri. We had probably 12, 15 state tax agencies that would come together several times a month. We would meet in St. Louis. I think we did that once or twice. We would meet in different places, and we would compare whether it's tax returns and our internal processing, and really get beyond what I talked about earlier, which is that NIH factor. And then that's where we got linked into, it's called then Revenue Canada, the big tax agency in Canada, one in Belgium, different places across the world, and see how they do it to be able to improve. Healthcare, they've won some of the Baldrige Awards. This Robert Woods Johnson is just a hospital I've selected that won the Baldrige Award in the last 5-10 years. I mentioned the Mayo Clinic. And then one of the focus we have now in the last year or so, as part of my involvement with the OES organization, education. Where I sit here in the state of Minnesota are 2 major education institutions: the city of Minneapolis School District, the city of St. Paul School District. You look at their academic performance in the last 5 years, and it's abysmal in terms of, if you've got, I don't have, but if you've got children send there, they've gone from something like 28,000 students down to probably 20,000 or less. They're leaving because their performance is not where it should be. So there's an opportunity there to get involved with education. But when you look at where some of these U.S. national Baldrige organizations, we have a Baldrige organization that covers the state of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, and some in Iowa. They're not engaged with education. Yes, it's a tough area. Go back to the quote I had from John Kennedy. It's not easy to change traditional education. But then you look at who's doing some of that, where it is across Europe. There's this organization called the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Close 25, 30, 40 countries. And they have built over the last few years education at a glance. So you can look at it in terms of educational outcomes. What are the critical outcomes for education? If you send your son or daughter or granddaughter or whoever to a college, what can they do? What are the actual outcomes that they can do? Not did they get a degree, not what is their GPA, what are they able to do? They have looked at that in terms of critical thinking skills for 8 to 10 years. But if I take this information and try to bring it back to my city of Minneapolis, they're not even touching it. So there's major opportunities of some school districts are doing it. Again, we can find that 5 or 10%. I think the Baldrige, you look at it, and they're over the last 10, 15 years, there's been a handful, probably 10 or less, K through 12, as they call it here in the United States, education schools have applied and continued with the Baldrige. When I was in state of Florida, the city of Orlando was going down that path. So there are some exceptional cases. But can our society, when you look at the importance of education and what I mentioned regarding climate change and sustainability of the planet, can we have a case where only 20 to 30% of our students at the K through 12 level are graduating perhaps in 4 years or whatever? So there are ample opportunities, and that's why we focus on it. So there's benchmarking occurring. It's just a matter of how you accelerate the number of organizations that are doing it. And then school district colleges and universities. No matter where you sit, for those of you on the line today, ask yourself, maybe it's your own alma mater where you went to college. Maybe it's right in the town you live in if you even didn't go there. Where I sit here in the University of Minnesota, large, one of the largest education organizations. They have 55,000 students. But you look at their outcomes. There's nothing in their strategic plan that I can see that measures critical thinking skills, for example, or links the University of Minnesota into some of this stuff involved with the OECD. They're not there. So there's ample opportunity to do benchmarking in the education sector. So then take all this in, and yeah, the world's out there doing this stuff. Is my organization ready? Whether this is yours or if you're a consultant and you want to say, gee, how do I get an organization to do it? This has to start at the top. Leadership mindset. I mean, I've been in organizations. I just talked to somebody yesterday here in one of our economic developments, and his statement to me was, I worked at organizations where we tried to do good stuff at the bottom up or side in, middle in level. You got to get leadership at the top of the organization to compare your results to others. When we went through it, and Quentin can talk to this, and we looked at 50 states, how many of the 50 state commissioners of revenue or executive directors wanted to or were willing to go there? Probably initially it was 5 or 10. We built it to 15 or 20, but that's a leadership mindset. And to be able to compare yourselves, like we did in Florida, comparing what we're doing to FedEx. Not a lot there. So you got to have a mindset to willing to do it, and then this continuous improvement. You get it, you do it, you put it in place for one area, but I want to learn how you perform relative to others. A lot of the feedback I've gotten from others in other countries is, how do you sustain this? So if you go back to my slide of what would you provide as your examples of most excellence organizations, some of them have been there. Like when I went to work for Xerox it was considered one of the best managed organizations in the business sector. So was Kodak. And you look at the Fortune 500 for the last 50 years, and there's maybe 5 or 10% that are still there. 3M, which is here in Minnesota, is one of them. But there's been a lot of organizations, a lot of turnover. So if you're going to sustain this, you got to have a focus on continuous improvement. Okay, how do I begin? All right, let me just walk through an example here, sort of what I've been through to say, okay, you want to start some of this. First, you got to, and this is the structured part of benchmark, document a business process. I mentioned hiring process. You want to use that as an example. Document your process. Have a vision. Have a mission. Don't just look at the metrics saying, where do I want to go? Where do I want to be 5 years from now? Measures and get the process steps. Then you've got to put together some kind of a team. You have a flow chart, sort of straightforward stuff, but it's structured. Just like if you're doing, there isn't, in the case of accounting and finance, there's regularly accepted financial processes or accounting standards. What we're building on here in the excellence community is a business process approach, structured benchmark. Then you end up with a one-page summary, and then you work your way through in your own organization. If you're big enough, that peer-to-peer. You got multiple areas. What we did in the Florida Department of Revenue, we had 5,000 employees. We had 3 major operational units. So compare one to the other. Peer-to-peer, office-to-office, best practice sharing within your own organization. That gives you a concrete sense of where you are. And we did here in Minnesota, we had one commissioner. He was the what's working commissioner. Everything he come into the meeting, what's working, what's not working. That's sort of the, when you go to the Baldrige, it's what are your strengths? What are your areas for improvement? And why are you there? Is it just evolved that way, or was there leadership or whatever? So you build your internal comparisons. Then, okay, I'm ready to go outside. I've done my data analysis. I've done my metrics. Then these are some of the things you walk through as you go outside, formal and strategic. Because you go outside, if you're going to benchmark with, like when I was in Florida, service excellence. Who do you want to benchmark in Florida? Oh, we want to go to Disney World. Okay. But it's not glorified tourism. It's not walk in and send, 10 people from your organization to Orlando and they spend a day or two and get to know Mickey Mouse and the rest of the characters. But how do you focus in on, your partner research? It's not looking, I went through a list of the top 10, 15 organizations you may identify. How do you identify who your partners are? And how do you get them to want to respond to share with you? You can't just say, well, we're just a startup organization and we want to benchmark and know what service excellence is. These exceptional organizations get a lot of requests, so they got to selectively be involved. It's a courting business process. I sort of like this, and when I was in Florida, I called it similar to courting before you're married. You got to get to know your partner. Then you put together a sales process, and there's confidentiality, and you don't want to make it too complex. But then this whole sense of a two-way learning approach. If you're going to go to an external organization, you got to know that's what I just went through, what you do well and what you can share with somebody else. So if you're going to a Baldrige winner or a winner of some award, yeah, they're going to have a lot of good stuff, but what can they learn from you? Find out your strengths and build that partnership and be authentic in all what you do. So these are the structured things. And by a sales package, this is giant, even though you may be an internal organization, you're selling this to the rest of the world. So you've got to approach this with return and just like a formal structured financial proposal as you might do in other areas. So that's the external side. Here's the resources. Just to use an example, if you don't know much about Global Benchmarking Network, it's been up and around. It was formed in the early 90s by Bob Camp that I mentioned, 20 or so organizations. You can touch on them, but then you got to be able to get to the point of that NIH factor, and how do you compare apples to apples? So this is just some idea of some of the organizations that are out there that have been down the path. And here's a little more detail. Within the Global Benchmarking Network, the Center for Excellence Research is available as a web page. There's a best practice improvement web page. But when you look at a lot of these divisions, a lot of these areas, there's still, you say, gee, there's a lot of resources out there. But then you relate it all back and you say, not many organizations are doing. What kind of entities are out there to help you, but not a lot of organizations are out looking at. So I mentioned again the municipal benchmarking, this ICMA center. There's other firms out there besides that. There's a group called the Hackett Group. There's McKinsey. Many of you know who some of the major consulting firms are. You can take them. But my whole sense of, you look at this, is still, after 30 to 35 years or more of involved with excellence in terms of these formal programs, whether it be our Baldrige effort here in the United States, the one in Canada, there's one in Australia. Probably a few years ago, there were 40 to 45 different excellence organizations. But if the reality is only 10% of organizations are doing excellence and 90% are not, you got to ask the question, what can we do differently? So if you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got. And in terms of Baldrige, I haven't heard recently, I checked a few weeks ago, our Baldrige in the United States has been going through an assessment period where as of last September, October, they hired a consulting firm to come in and really assess because they're not having impact. Their number of applications is going like this. And so they need to reassess, because you look at if 90% of the organizations are not aware of excellence number one or doing any kind of benchmarking. If that's a business, you got to say, gee, are they going to be in business for long? So there's a lot of organizations out there, but they're not having impact. And these are just some that I came across in my work. In Florida, there was a benchmarking consortium that included at one point 15 or 20 state agencies and local agencies in the state of Florida. There was a similar one in North Carolina, but they haven't been sustained. Some of these are dependent on one person. I think in North Carolina, at University of North Carolina, there was a professor, he retired, wasn't sustained. So there's a lot of organizations out there, numerous books. I've made proposals to our GBN. Bob Camp wrote his first book on benchmarking in 1989, which is 34 years ago. There hasn't been a lot of updates since then. So a lot of opportunity to find ways to accelerate this. How can we help? We being, whether it's me and my organization, me and my partnership with OES, this is sort of the things that we get involved in. OES specifically gets involved with, okay, if you got an organization, we're doing that now for the public sector and some in the education sector, come in and say, okay, let's do an assessment. We've got an assessment for, on a teaser basis, you can do in a half hour, get 5 or 10 people to your organization that may know little or nothing about excellence and assess where you are. Try to put your stake in the ground. So coaching on how do you get to where you are? What's your level of maturity? What do you know about process management? So we've been through a lot of this. And so the major areas, I worked with a guy a little bit, quite a few years ago, on customer service excellence, phone calls, logging in to various avenues into the public sector organization. How does that compare? How do you compare, public sector access in state of Minnesota versus a province of Canada versus we went into New Zealand? So these are some of the areas that you can get help with. Expert advice, database tracking, that whole sense of ROI. I mentioned earlier, you can get anywhere from 100, 200, 300% improvement by just investing a little bit in it. Rather than redefining a wheel, saying we're different, sort of addressing the NIH factor, not invented here, and then saying, well, we've got to develop it on our own. The ROI is extraordinary when you do it properly. These next few slides, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, are just where I've been in my fortunate world of being involved. And I mentioned the money back guarantees, tax agencies. That's been performance measurement, process measurement, service delivery across various institutions and countries, leadership development. In the Florida Department of Revenue, we went out for leadership. We were looking to things like, succession planning. How often and how do we do it? We had no succession planning. We went out and did a formal, structured benchmarking process, and we looked at private sector, Whirlpool, one of the companies very well known here in Minnesota, Medtronic. We looked at UPS, Baldrige Winners. So we went out and did succession planning as it relates to leadership development, human resources, the whole area of best practices, and this whole thing I've got at the bottom again here, a Gallup. How do we sustain it? We had 360-degree assessments in Florida. We had performance assessment. We had engagement. How do our data compare? Well, how do we improve? Do we get in that top 20% where we can compare to perhaps some organizations that exist in other places that have got 80, 90, 95% employee engagement? How do you compare that back to what Gallup said? So you can look at human resource area. And here's sort of where I come to the summary here. How do you sustain it? The 3 P's that I call it: persistence, perseverance, and passion. Humility, you're always learning. And it's a responsibility. I've had these thoughts for many years, but now in the world of the major entrenched global issues we face, we got to come together and address these, because I don't think personally that we have 5, 10, maybe 15 years. If you talk to anyone in the climate change area, just this report, if you haven't read it, go out and look at it in the last day or so. Another one that says maybe we got to 2030, maybe we got to 2035. Some of the changes in climate, some countries is not coming until 2070, 2080. Do we have that long? To me, benchmarking, which is looking at history, using innovation and everything to accelerate, to change, and so we can meet some of those global climate change expectations. So that's my focus. I've had some of this in my presentation before, and it's a quote that was attributed to Robert Kennedy when he was taken from us in 1968. His brother Teddy Kennedy used it from original quote, supposedly from George Bernard Shaw. Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream things that never were and ask why not. That's sort of where I have been for the last 5, 10 years. Having a vision of saying, we want to be in the top 10%. We were in the Florida Department of Revenue say, we're going to be competitive with private sector organizations. As Dan and Guy know, some of the founders of the ICCS, same kind of thing. How do we sustain this for a period of time? And then this final quote I got from just a few months ago from one of the other founders of ICCS in Canada. Somebody who went to Harvard about 100 years ago, finished it and said, knowledge has no value until applied for the benefit of mankind. So we have a lot of benchmarking reports, a lot of things that go out there. But if you don't take them and deploy it and implement them, what value do they have for mankind? So that's a lot of even why I'm getting to the academic sector, the old thing of the academics of it's an ivory tower, a lot of tremendous knowledge. But if it doesn't get to mankind and the major issues we face, it's there, the solutions. When you read this report that came out just yesterday on climate change, some of the prominent writers of that will tell you we have the solutions. We've just got to implement. So I think benchmarking can help to do that. So that's it. We've got maybe 7, 8, 10 minutes. We can go over if you'd like, but you're welcome to put your raise your hand or offer a suggestion in the chat. But I'll turn off the record now, and you can ask any questions you like.